The chairman of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping, promised support and deeper cooperation to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov during a meeting held in China as part of the Russian Foreign Minister's visit to the meeting of foreign ministers of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization member states. The meeting between the chairman of the People's Republic of China and the Russian foreign minister took place shortly after US President Donald Trump expressed his disappointment with Vladimir Putin and issued a 50-day ultimatum, which now concerns not only the Russian Federation but also China itself. This refers to the possible introduction of 100% tariffs for countries that purchase Russian oil. As is well known, the purchase of Russian oil by countries such as China, India or Brazil is a crucial factor for the survival of the Russian economy amid ongoing Western sanctions. If it weren't for Chinese support, it is possible that Russian President Vladimir Putin would have long since had to abandon the war of attrition model with neighboring Ukraine and at least consider a ceasefire on the Russian-Ukrainian front. However, the optimistic tone of Sergei Lavrov, who spoke sarcastically about Donald Trump's ultimatum, reminding the audience at his press conference about the 24 hours or 100 days, and noting that Russia has already gone through a whole series of sanctions, indicates that Moscow continues to reasonably count on Chinese support, even after the President of the United States linked Russian and Chinese interests in his efforts to put an end to military actions on the Russian-Ukrainian front. As is well known, recently the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China and one of Xi Jinping's closest associates, Wang Yi, during a meeting with representatives of the European Commission, stated that China will not allow Russia to be defeated in the war with Ukraine. It is obvious that for Xi Jinping and his associates, Russia's success in the war with Ukraine is also a success for Moscow in its confrontation with the West. China may believe that the collapse of the West's hopes to contain Russia will help strengthen China's own geopolitical influence in the proxy into which the Russian state is degenerating. And indeed, when have we ever seen the president of Russia telling Chinese journalists that his closest relatives are studying Chinese on their own initiative? When else could we have stated the actual end of Russia as a European project and the transformation of the Russian Federation into a state that primarily relies on relationships with countries of the global south? When else has China's economic influence on the Russian economy been decisive for the survival of that economy in Russia's confrontation with the West? Of course, this is an entirely new, I would even say historically new situation. The Soviet Union, which fought against Western democracies in the Cold War for many decades, did not depend on Chinese support, and for a certain period even supported China itself. And the Chinese communists, led by Mao Zedong, won the civil war in their country only thanks to Stalin's support. But now the situation is completely different. And it seems that Xi Jinping is quite pleased with this situation. Otherwise, he wouldn't have discussed with Sergei Lavrov the need to continue supporting the Russian Federation at a time when China should be considering what consequences Trump's ultimatum could have for the country's economy if it is actually implemented. But for authoritarian regimes, the economy is a secondary or even tertiary concern compared to the interests of political hegemony and the catastrophe in the rival camp. All the more so because authoritarian regimes have an advantage over this rival camp. Democratic leaders are forced to come from an environment where electoral interests must be taken into account. They cannot allow a sharp deterioration in the lives of their compatriots who would simply vote against them or against the parties they represent or lead in the next presidential and parliamentary elections. Authoritarian leaders, such as the chairman of the People's Republic of China or the president of the Russian Federation, have no concerns about how public sentiment might change if the social conditions of Chinese or Russian citizens worsen, especially if this decline in living standards can be explained by the machinations of the West and the desire of Western countries to weaken the geopolitical role of nations like Russia or China. And we are witnessing something very similar right now. Therefore, of course, to say that China will agree to the American ultimatum and stop purchasing Russian oil by the deadline set by Trump would be to put it mildly, short-sighted. I believe that in the coming days, weeks, and months, China will only increase its support for the Russian Federation, openly demonstrating its complete disregard for Donald Trump's demands. But this will not be done openly, because as we have already seen, Beijing fully understands that an open conflict between the representative of the People's Republic of China and the President of the United States does not help strengthen Beijing's position on the international stage and creates additional difficulties for the Chinese economy, which is already not in the best condition. Therefore, Beijing will act constructively, possibly even demonstrating a reduction in the amount of oil received from Russia through legal supply channels. But they will look for opportunities for energy cooperation with Moscow in such a way that the Americans can't find any fault, and in such a way that Donald Trump cannot make any additional claims against the leadership of the People's Republic of China. All the more so because we perfectly understand that any tariff war between Washington and Beijing, if it begins, takes into account not only Chinese but also American economic interests. And the recent tariff clash between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping did not at all end solely on Donald Trump's terms. Washington was forced to enter into negotiations with Beijing, which ended in a compromise. Nevertheless, it is clear that after things have been called by their proper names and everyone in the world understands that Russia is waging war precisely because the countries of the global south support its economy and that China, India, and Brazil are buying Russian oil, it will become increasingly difficult for the Chinese leadership to pretend that China is not involved in what is happening in the Russia-Ukraine war. Given today's meeting between Xi Jinping and Sergei Lavrov, the Chinese leadership is hardly even trying to hide this anymore. Thank you, friends. Stay tuned and subscribe. Subscribe to my social media and my channels on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and Donatello, which help support and develop these resources. Use the sponsorship feature right here on YouTube. Peace to you.